Okay, and good afternoon. And it's Memorial Day weekend. So I'm doing some talks, fitting Memorial Day weekend. And it used to be Declaration Day, remember?
Oh, yeah.
And used to be Armistice Day in November, but it's now Veterans Day, so there are two things that are gone. But a lot of things that happened in 1917, 107 years later, believe it or not, still impacts your life. Like the Espionage Act, which may be tested in Florida sometime this year, and I'll discuss that. Woodrow Wilson was against women getting the right to vote.
The nerve.
And it got nasty in 1917, very, very nasty in 1917 for some women. In New York City on Fifth Avenue, there was an anti-lynching protest, or a protest that was about lynching and get rid of lynching, have an anti-lynching law put into effect. The KKK, Birth of a Nation, the KKK, Ku Klux Klan, is getting a revival. There is a 1917 Immigration Act, which would lead to a 1921 Immigration Act, which would lead to the mother of all immigration acts in 1924, when basically the country, the Statue of Liberty, said, don't come to a number of people. Puerto Ricans became citizens. This is downtown San Juan. America buys the Danish Virgin Islands. Prohibition gains traction. This is in Boston. That's me actually taking the picture of this. Carrie Nation, who was the leading prohibitionist of her time, and that was the first speakeasy ever in Boston, and they decided, hey, you know, it's a good name, why don't we keep the name? It's down the street from the State House. The Russian Revolution, there were actually two Russian revolutions that year. The Balfour Declaration, give the Jews some land in Palestine for a home state. That was 107 years ago. The National Hockey League started in 1917 and it's still going strong today, and that's me 40 years ago with Gordie Howe, who was the greatest hockey player of his era. We were playing in a charity game raising money for Special Olympics. Well, the 1914
the green uniform.
of those green uniforms, I still have that in my house. I still fit in it.
What team did this?
So it was just a charity game.
Random.
Yeah, charity game. Archduke Ferdinand, and it's his assassination that triggers World War I. Franz Ferdinand was the heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he and his wife were assassinated by a gunman during a drive-through in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. Ferdinand ignored warnings that the Serbians were going to kill him, especially the group Black Hand. And they were upset because the Austrian annexation took place in 1908, and they were plotting to assassinate him. And they had the date all picked out. June 28th, he's going there, and that's Serbian National Day. And Franz's wife said, Franz, Sophie, his wife said, maybe you ought to reconsider. We can always go to Sarajevo another time of year. It's beautiful in the winter, and you can go skiing in the winter. You know, they're going to have an Olympics there one year. And he said, no, we could go, we'll be safe, nothing is going to happen to us, let's go. And so they go. The assassination was traced to a Serbian extremist group that wanted to increase Serbian power in the Baltics by breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. World War I was known as the Great War, and it starts on July 28, 1914. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, and the tenuous peace between Europe's great powers quickly collapsed. Within a week, Russia, Belgium, France, Great Britain, and Serbia lined up against Austria-Hungary and Germany, and World War I began. The Austro-Hungarian Empire attacked Serbia in response. Germany supported Austria-Hungary, while Russia sided with its traditional ally, Serbia. And this guy, President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, is watching. He's also just been re-elected as President of the United States in 1960. At the outbreak of fighting, the United States remained on the sidelines of World War I, adopting a policy of neutrality favored by the President, Woodrow Wilson. while continuing to engage in commerce and shipping with European countries on both sides of the conflict. On August the 4th, Wilson declared, excuse me, thank you. On August the 4th, Wilson declared that the United States would remain impartial in thought and as well as action. But that's beginning to change with the sinking of the Lusitania off the Irish coast in 1915. I did a talk on 1918 the other day. A woman who was born in Ireland says they still talk about the sinking of the Lusitania all these, more than a century later. In 1915, Germany declared the waters surrounding the British Isles to be a war zone. And German U-boats sunk several commercial and passenger vessels, and that includes some U.S. ships. Widespread protest over the sinking of the U-boat of the British ocean liner Lusitania traveling from New York to Liverpool. That was its run, New York to Liverpool, Liverpool to New York, with hundreds of American passengers on board. May 7th, 1915, helped turn the tide of American political opinion against Germany. Another ship that was torpedoed, the SS Arabic, torpedoed by the Germans. On August 19, 1915, German submarines sunk the British ocean liner and claimed self-defense. The event further strained relations between the United States and Germany. Wilson warned Germany that if it was determined they sunk the ship without cause, the United States may cut diplomatic ties with them and enter the war. Well, Germany is not really that phased, but they caved at that point. And in September announced, well, we're not going to sink any passenger ships without warning. Satisfied for at least the moment, Wilson chose not to declare war on Germany despite being encouraged by others, including some of his cabinet members, and also Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt wanted to go to war with Germany. Well, the presidential election of 1916, and this is the campaign slogan, he kept us out of war. And that's enough of a reason to re-elect Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States. The United States presidential election took place while Europe was embroiled in World War I. Public sentiment in the still neutral United States leaned towards the British and the French, the Allies, due to the harsh treatment of civilians by the German army, which had invaded and occupied large parts of Belgium and northern France. And this is unusual, somebody with a beard running for president in the 20th century. If you think of the presidents in the 20th century, Roosevelt had a mustache, Teddy Roosevelt. Wilson, no. Harding, no. Coolidge, no. Hoover, no. FDR, no. Harry Truman, no. Eisenhower, no. Kennedy, no. Lyndon Johnson, no. Dick Nixon, no. Gerald Ford, no. Jimmy Carter, no. And then Ronald Reagan, no. And George H.W. Bush, no. And Bill Clinton, no. Roosevelt's the only guy in the 20th century that wore a mustache. And in the 21st century, George W. Bush, no. Barack Obama, no. Trump, no. And Joe Biden, no. And nobody has run for office with a beard since then. He's the last guy. The campaign pitted the incumbent Wilson and the Democratic candidate against the Supreme Court Justice Charles Evans Hughes, the Republican candidate. Despite their sympathy with the Allied forces, most American voters wanted to avoid involvement in the war and preferred to continue the policy of neutrality. Wilson's campaign slogan, he kept us out of war, and America first, America first. But there was a war going on involving America, and that was with Mexico. And there were raids going back and forth with Mexico. So America was at least in theory, at war with Mexico. But the Americans wanted to avoid a war with Mexico or Europe. Hughes criticized Wilson for not taking the necessary preparations to face a conflict. Wilson is against the women having the right to vote. And in 1917, it gets really, really nasty for women in Washington. Really nasty. Wilson authored the Democratic platform in 1916, and he campaigned on the record of the previous administration particularly stressing the fact that he had maintained a neutral foreign policy in respect to World War I as he ran again. Wilson also refused to support a constitutional amendment guaranteeing women the right to vote. 1916 presidential election, we have Hughes criticizing Wilson, despite the fact that public sentiment was against war, and Hughes also harped on Wilson's failed efforts to overthrow the military dictatorship in Mexico. Hughes said, let the women vote. Hughes campaigned actively, but here we get into the personalities. And when you watch presidential debates on TV, this question always comes up. Does he look presidential? Well, if you watch the 1960 debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon, Kennedy did look presidential. Nixon had a 5 o'clock shadow. He was sweating profusely. He was standing like this because he hurt his knee. He didn't look presidential, according to some. So back then, 1916, Hughes was described as having a wooden personality, and he failed to excite the American public. Wilson probably wins. Kansas, Minnesota, sure. California, which didn't have very many votes in those days, in doubt. He prevailed, Wilson. It was a much closer election than anticipated. Wilson got 49.4% of the vote, 277 electoral votes. Hughes got 46.2%, 254 electoral votes. It was the first time since 1892 in which a Democrat was elected to a second term, and the first since 1832 that a Democrat was elected to a consecutive term. That was Andrew Jackson. 1892 was Grover Cleveland, who was president, and lost to Benjamin Harrison and won again. Wilson enters 1917 as the man whose campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." Meanwhile, the war continues in Europe, and it is devolving into a stalemate. The war on the Western Front had become one of attrition as 1917 drew to a close. The French army was exhausted, having borne the brunt of the Allied effort and the trauma of Verdun. The British were beginning to suffer manpower shortages, taking over from the French in 1917. The German army was weakened despite being able to concentrate entirely on the Western Front. Following the defeat of Russia, its manpower was rapidly diminishing, and the Ally, Austria-Hungary, was crumbling. This, in part, gets America into the war. It's called the Zimmerman Telegram, and it's from Western Union. But all it has on here is a bunch of numbers, like 14471, or this one, 9110. So it's all coded. But somebody in Britain managed to crack the code. And with that, America says, hey, wait a minute, maybe we need to get into this war. In January, British intelligence intercepted a telegram from the German Foreign Minister, Arthur Zimmermann, to the German Minister to Mexico, Heinrich von Eckhardt. The Zimmermann telegram stated that Germany planned to return to unrestricted submarine warfare and would sink all ships, including those carrying American passengers in any war zone. The British did not tell the Americans about the Zimmermann telegram initially, because they didn't want the Germans to find out that the British code breakers intercepted the telegram and broke the code. However, following Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare in February, the British decided to use the note as a way to sway American official and public opinion to join the war. This is would be part of Mexico if it wasn't for James Polk back in the 1840s. This is Monterey in California. The telegram also proposed an alliance between Germany and Mexico should the United States join the European allies. If Mexico agreed, Germany would help them regain the territories they lost to America in the Mexican-American War back in 1848, including the states of Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, with pieces of other states in California. The Mexicans didn't bite. Breaking diplomatic ties with Germany. Breaking up is so hard to do, except in this instance where breaking up was not hard to do. February 3rd, Wilson severed diplomatic relations with Germany, moving the United States a step closer to entering World War I. Wilson acted after Theobald von Berthmann-Hollweg, the German chancellor, declared that Germany would resume unlimited submarine warfare on January 31st. Wilson maintained that we do not desire any hostile conflict with the German government. He nevertheless asserted that if Germany followed through on its threat to sink American ships without warning, it would find itself at war with the United States. The Zimmerman telegram was given to Wilson on February 24th. Wilson waited until March 20th, convening a cabinet meeting, and he brings up the matter a month after he saw the telegram. And very quickly, America springs to war. Breaking off the diplomatic ties with Germany, the sinking of 5 American ships, something had to be done. And on April 6, 1917, Congress voted to declare war on Germany. Wilson had asked Congress for a war to end all wars that would make the world safe for democracy. There would be a draft. Men would be drafted and sent off to Europe. May 18th, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which authorized the federal government to temporarily expand the military through conscription. The act eventually required all men between the ages of 21 and 45 to register for military services. Under the act, approximately 24 million men registered for the draft. Of the total of U.S. troops sent to Europe, 2.8 million men have been drafted and 2 million have volunteered. First American troops arrived in Europe in late June. The troops did not fully participate at the front until October, when the 1st Division, one of the best trained divisions of the American military, entered the trenches at Nancy, France. The Doughboys. How many of you remember the term Doughboys? Over there, over there, over there. Well, the Doughboys are coming. That was a popular nickname for the American infantrymen during World War I. The Great War marked the first time in history the United States sent soldiers abroad to defend foreign soil. The French, they were really happy with the first wave of soldiers. Viva la America! And almost everybody who was drafted had to go. In memory of John Purry Mitchell, Mayor of New York City, 1914 to 1918, born July 19, 1879, died in the service of the United States July 6, 1918. So even the mayor of New York City, who at that point was, 38 years old, he had to serve. Didn't care if he was the mayor of New York City, he had to serve. The troops, yes?
Do you know where the term doughboy came from?
It came from the 1800s some points. Various soldiers were called doughboys. And they just applied it to them. And then the Pillsbury Doughboy. How many of you used it? Yeah, the Pillsbury Doughboy. They just, why don't we use the Pillsbury Doughboy? The Yanks. Well, some of the nicknames: Yanks, Sammies, Pershing's Crusaders. Some of the names used to label the American enlisted men in World War I. Pershing Crusaders and the Sammies for Uncle Sam made some appearances in advertising and propaganda posters, but they weren't well liked by the troops. They just wanted to be called Yanks. More than 4 million American men, along with support from non-military personnel that were needed for war, were sent to Europe, and by November 17th, Americans were on the battlefield. And that led to a bunch of songs. How many of you remember this one? Over There. George M. Cohan, Over There. Give my regards to Broadway. Well, this one is Over There. He wrote it, George M. Cohan, after he learned that the U.S. had abandoned their policy of non-intervention and planned to enter World War I on the side of the Allied powers. Over There was probably the greatest of all wartime propaganda songs. It was made famous by Nora Bayes, who popularized 2 other songs back in 1908. And of the 3 songs, just one of the songs really lasts till today. The other songs, Shine On Harvest Moon, which was co-written with her husband, Jack Norwith, and another song that Norwith did that you might have heard about, Take Me Out to the Ballgame.
Right.
Which of the three songs survives in popular culture? Yeah, that's it. Oh, how I hate to get up in the morning, Irving Berlin. Over There and Don't Send My Darling Boy Away were two popular songs. There was an anti-German Bing Bang Bingham on the Rhine. Other songs that were written included Irving Berlin's How I Hate to Get Up in the Morning, I Don't Want to Get Well, a duet by Arthur Fields and Gracie Woods. And African Americans actually helped out in the war fighting. And this is a song called The Colored Soldier Boys of Uncle Sam, We're Coming. Sort of a play on the Yanks Are Coming. And it was written by W.J. Nickerson and published in New Orleans. African Americans who had participated in every military conflict since the inception of the United States enlisted and prepared for involvement. However, many of those who were enlisted or drafted found themselves in non-combative support roles. Many African Americans served under the Services of Supply section of the American American Expeditionary Forces, a section comprised of stevedores, labor, and engineers service battalions and companies. The main function of these companies, support and provide materials to other companies along the front. The notable exception were the soldiers who fought on the front lines in the 92nd and 93rd Infantry Divisions. The 369th Colored Soldiers Infantry Regiment, known as the Harlem Hellfighters, were assigned to the French Army in April. In this post, the Hellfighters served much of the action fighting in the Second Battle of the Marne, as well as the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. For his valiant and brave actions during World War I, Private Henry Johnson of the 369th became the first American to receive the War Cross from France. An additional 170 members of the 369th also were awarded the French Medal. Sports takes a back seat. If you're an able baseball player, you should be in the war. There's no reason why you should be playing baseball. And baseball was the national pastime. It was the only sport that really mattered. There was some boxing around, some horse racing, but baseball was it. And Hank Gallivan, catcher with the Boston Nationals, the Boston Braves, is the first to enlist. In the United States, most professional sports teams shut down. Baseball didn't. During World War I, athletic men were needed for the war effort. Work or fight orders compelled professional athletes to join the military. Public opinion turned against athletes who chose to stay in the United States and play ball rather than join their fellow countrymen in combat. You've heard of Jack Dempsey, right? The boxer? Jack Dempsey didn't serve during World War I, claimed that he was his family's sole provider in terms of money. And Dempsey would carry a reputation down the road that he was a draft dodger. And that made him more popular because they wanted to see boxers fight against him and knock him out because he was a draft dodger. On June 1st, the Boston Braves catcher Hank Gallivan was the first Major League Baseball player to enlist in the United States military.
Were they not subject to the draft?
They were, but he enlisted. The Army General, Enoch Crowther, convinced Newton Baker, the U.S. Secretary of War at the time, that any draft-eligible men employed in non-essential jobs, baseball player, non-essential, should be forced to choose, enlist to help stateside or risk going to fight the front lines. The Espionage Act. Donald Trump in Florida has been brought up on charges of violating the Espionage Act in 2023. This goes back to 1917, the Espionage Act, and it's Woodrow Wilson's first attempt at trampling Americans' rights under the Constitution, like freedom of speech. The Espionage Act of 1917 was passed by Congress on June 15. It was an outgrowth of the federal government's efforts during World War I to contain not only espionage, but also public criticism of war efforts. The Espionage Act cracked down on wartime activities considered dangerous or disloyal, including attempts to acquire defense-related information with the intent to harm the United States or acquire code and signal books, photographs, blueprints, such as other documents with the intention of passing them to America's enemies. The Espionage Act was based on the Defense Secrets Act, 1911, especially the notions of obtaining or delivering information relating to national defense to a person who is not entitled to have it. The espionage law imposed much stiffer penalties than the 1911 Act. Don't talk. The web is spun for you with invisible threads. Keep out of it. Help destroy it. Stop, think, and ask yourself if what you were about to say might help the enemy. Spies are listening. The Espionage Act. The Act outlawed false statements intended to interfere with the military operations and attempts to incite insubordination or obstruct the recruitment of troops, and false statements promoting the success of America's enemies. Those charged with the violations were subject to $10,000 fine, which would be $264,000 today, and 20 years of imprisonment. If the crimes were committed during wartime, the punishment could be 30 years of imprisonment or the death penalty. How many of you ever heard of Emma Goldman?
Yeah.
What do you know about Emma Goldman?
She's a communist.
She was a communist. Anything else?
Statue of Liberty.
No. Emma Goldman in 1916 was arrested after giving a speech on birth control. Birth control,
Wow.
1916. She was Russian. She's arrested in 1917 under the Espionage Act. She was an anarchist. Yeah, she was a communist. And she actively protested the war, encouraged men not to register for the draft. She was arrested on June 15th. She was prosecuted and convicted for conspiring against the draft under the Espionage Act. Goldman was an anarchist, political activist, a writer renowned for her vehement advocacy for free speech, women's rights. She was arrested in 1916, advocating birth control, also voting, and social reform in the late 19th and 20th century. She was sentenced to 2 years in prison. Take a look at this ad put out by the U.S. government. That's a German, and that's an American.
Wow.
Looks kind of like King Kong, doesn't it?
Yes.
A little bit?
Yes.
Destroy this mad brute, enlist U.S. Army. Committee on Public Information was created by Wilson to promote patriotism. He established the committee in April through Executive Order 2594 in response to the U.S. entry into World War I in an attempt to mobilize public opinion behind the war effort with every available form of mass communication. Those days, it was magazines, newspapers. That was it. And also posters at various places. Radio was in its infancy in terms of becoming commercialized, and there was no TV. So it was mostly print. Visual images helped to mobilize the war, support for the war. The Division of Pictorial Publicity joined with the Division of Advertising to create some of the war's most vivid images in posters designed to demonize the German military. Some of the more infamous posters portrayed a German guerrilla with a club labeled Kultur and green-eyed, blue-skinned German soldier with bloody fingers. I also forgot the other thing was movies, silent movies at the time, so you could see the images at the movies. That's America's sweetheart, Mary Pickford. She became the first millionaire from movies. She signed a major contract in 1916. Little American is the name of that movie, and she was from the British Northern Territories, or Canada. She might have been Canadian sweetheart. Through the Committee on Public Information, Wilson's speechwriter, George Creel, deployed the 4 Minutemen into neighborhood movie theaters in order to spread pro-war propaganda. American producers began to bank on wartime propaganda as the U.S. moved away from neutrality and towards putting boots on the ground in Europe. Mary Pickford played a plucky heroine who survives a German U-boat attack in the Cecil B. DeMille-directed Little American. Before long, America's sweetheart, she was from British North America or Canada, was on tour with Douglas Fairbanks and Charlie Chaplin of England. shilling for Liberty bonds. This becomes nasty in 1917, very nasty. Wilson is against women getting the right to vote. Like I said, it becomes really, really nasty. Alice Paul, you heard about Alice Paul? You know who she is? Okay, for those who don't know who she was a women's rights activist, a major women's rights activist. And she led the fight to get women the right to vote in the United States, but it's a fight that landed her in jail because politicians didn't think American women should vote. She was born in 1885. She was brought up in New Jersey. She was a Quaker. And Quaker values, which were based on, or are based on, equality, racial and gender equality. She pursued an unusually high level of education for a woman of that time. She graduated Swarthmore in 1905. She received her master's in sociology in 1907, a PhD in economics in 1912 from the University of Pennsylvania. She was a highly educated woman. She went to England to study social justice, and she ran into Emmeline and Christabella Pankhurst, who were leading the movement in the United Kingdom, asking for the right for women to vote. And she decided to join the Pankhurst movement in the UK for the vote, and she learned everything that she possibly could from that social movement and brought it back to America. And there is Alice Paul, a little later in life. She's about 30 years old at that point. Alice Paul realized that being polite and asking sweetly for the right to vote was not getting women anywhere, and that radical tactics were necessary. For a woman, that meant standing on the street corner, holding a sign, speaking out from a stage, considered radical acts. While in prison, she learned that hunger strikes were an effective way to get attention and to bring sympathy to the cause. She returned, excuse me?
What was she thrown in prison for?
With the
Standing on the
Pankhurst.
street.
Yeah, basically. Paul returned to the United States in 1910, and she was looking for women's right to vote. After the deaths of Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1902 and Susan B. Anthony in 1906, the movement was lacking. They lacked focus because the organizations that existed weren't doing anything except getting maybe some states to say, yeah, let women vote. Paul believed that the movement needed to focus on the passage of federal women's rights amendment to the Constitution. 1911, she led Philadelphia's first street corner campaign for the right to vote. Night after night, for 2 months, speaking from a horse-drawn cart, Paul and other suffragettes made their case to crowds that sometimes numbered in the hundreds. She was, yes.
There's a show opening on Broadway called Suff.
About this?
Yeah,
Yeah.
S-U-F-F-S.
Yeah. She was joined by Lucy Burns. She was from Brooklyn, and they met in London, and they were demonstrating. And there is Lucy Burns. Paul and Burns offered to take over the National Women's Suffrage Association Congressional Committee in Washington, D.C., which was tasked with promoting a constitutional amendment. Paul topped her action list with a plan for a parade, a spectacle of a sort never seen in Washington. And it would take place on March the 3rd, 1913, official program, Women's Suffrage Procession. That was her thing. On March 3rd, 1913, day before Wilson's presidential inauguration, 8,000 female marchers wearing white or in colorful caps and capes interspersed with mounted brigades and decorated floats unspooled on Pennsylvania Avenue. First float proclaimed, "We demand an amendment to the Constitution of the United States enfranchising the women of the country." Demand was an incendiary word, something nice women didn't do. They were putting an unsympathetic Wilson on notice that they expected action soon. No sooner was Paul's parade underway than thousands of onlookers spilled onto its path, blocking its progress. Men spit at the marchers. Men spit at the marchers, threw lighted cigarettes at them, hurled insults, Police stood calmly by. To the surprise of many, Alice Paul was actually pleased by the chaos. The parade made news from coast to coast. These are the silent sentinels.
Sentinel.
Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? New York Times didn't like this. I'll tell you that in a minute. By 1917, with little progress to show, a fresh approach was needed to gain traction. On June 10th, Paul led 12 women to the White House gates bearing huge banners that challenged Woodrow Wilson. Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Another asked, Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Well, these women called themselves the Silent Sentinels because they did not speak a word. The New York Times called them this: silent, silly, and offensive. Just think of that. Day after day, the women reported for duty, through rain and through snow. Wilson unwittingly gave the Silent Sentinels a new ammunition with his speech to Congress seeking a declaration of war. We shall fight for the things we have always carried nearest to our hearts for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government. Women do not have a voice in the federal government. Okay, it gets worse for Alice Paul and her colleagues. There are protests, there are beatings, and there are arrests. Paul's demonstrators immediately seized on Wilson's words. New banners asked how America could claim to be a democracy when 20 million women couldn't vote. The president was scorned as Kaiser Wilson. The scene at the White House gates turned ugly. Counter-protesters, fired by patriotic zeal, soldiers, called the women traitors. They seized their banners. They shredded them, some of them injuring women in the process. And here's that Kaiser Wilson placard. Kaiser Wilson, have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they weren't self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. And these people are becoming more radical. Women carrying banners were attacked by enraged soldiers who were in Washington and sailors. The pickets were arrested, spent days, weeks in jails on trumped-up charges of obstructing traffic. Paul drew a sentence of 7 months. Denied status as a political prisoner, she began a hunger strike. Others followed suit, prompting authorities to begin force feeding. This is Lucy Burns. She also is in jail, and listen to the conditions. On November 14th, 31 pickets were dispatched to a Virginia workhouse, burrowed into cold cells plagued with rats and flies, forced into hard labor, and fed a starvation diet. Eventually, news of their mistreatment reached the newspapers. Between the news of the women prisoners being mistreated and New York voters saying yes in 1917 for women to vote, members of Congress read the writing on the wall and told Wilson, drop the opposition. And there's one of the parades in Washington, D.C. Silent protest parades. Actually, this one is the lynching parade in New York City. On July 28th, the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People Silent Protest Parade, also known as a Silent March, took place on Fifth Avenue in New York City. The protest was a response to violence against African Americans, including race riots, lynching, and outrages in Texas, Illinois, and Tennessee, and other states. But one in particular got these people out. The East St. Louis, Illinois race riot, also called the East St. Louis Massacre, that started on July 2nd, was a major catalyst of this silent parade. The horrific event drew close to 6,000 blacks from their own burning homes and left several hundred dead. So 6,000 African Americans are displaced and a whole bunch of people are dead. This is going on as the Ku Klux Klan is revived in America, thanks to Woodrow Wilson. The popularity of the W.D. Griffith film, Birth of the Nation, and its specific appearance in Atlanta in December 1915 provided the major impetus for the reemergence of the Klan. The ongoing racism, fueled by the film, led a local recruiter for the men's fraternal societies, a guy by the name of William J. Simons, to establish a new KKK. But it's Woodrow Wilson that lights the fire. Because in February 1915, upon viewing The Birth of the Nation at a special White House screening, Wilson reportedly remarked, "It's like writing history with lightning. My only regret is that it is all so terribly true." Wilson believed in the lost cause. He segregated the post office, which was the home to over 60% of federal jobs at the time and employed many black workers. The KKK was on the rise. Also going on, the Statue of Liberty. Go home, go home, go home. Over the next 7 years, there would be all kinds of immigration laws that were written aimed at communists, anarchists, and Eastern Europeans, Italians, and Jews. Let's get them out of the country. Let's keep the country British. Let's keep the country Norwegian. On February 5th, the Immigration Act of 1917 was passed by the 64th Congress with an overwhelming majority, overriding Woodrow Wilson's December 14th, 1916 veto. Immigration Act required literacy tests for immigrants and barred Asian laborers, except from those with countries with special treaties or agreements with the United States, such as the Philippines. The act added to and consolidated the list of undesirables banned from entering the country. Here is the list of undesirables: alcoholics, anarchists, contract laborers, criminals, convicts, epileptics, feeble-minded persons, idiots. Yeah, idiots. That's in the bill. Illiterates, imbeciles, insane persons, paupers, persons afflicted with contagious disease, persons being mentally or physically defective, persons with constitutional psychopathic inferiority, political radicals, polygamists, that was aimed at the Mormons, prostitutes, and vagrants, because the stock that was in the country in the 1890s, they were the real Americans. The Immigration Act of 1917 would affect this neighborhood. That included Hester Street, Suffolk Street, and Eldridge Street, the Lower East Side of Manhattan, and that's Ellis Island. It affected European immigration with the provision banning all immigrants over the age of 16 who were illiterate. Happy that my grandfather got into this country before then because he was functionally illiterate. Literacy was designed as the ability to read 30 to 40 words of their own language in ordinary text. Meanwhile, as we look at San Juan, Puerto Rico, Puerto Ricans became American citizens in 1917. In 1898, Spain ceded the island and the Philippines to the United States as a result of its defeat in the Spanish-American War under the terms of the Treaty of Paris of 1898. Wilson signed the Jones-Shafforth Act on March 2nd, giving Puerto Ricans U.S. citizenship. Puerto Ricans would receive American benefits, but would not be allowed to vote in presidential election and would not have representation in Congress, but Puerto Ricans could serve as part of the United States military. Meanwhile, well, that's still the same thing that's going on today. Hasn't changed 107 years later, still the same in Puerto Rico. Meanwhile, the American Virgin Islands decided to rest on the tree. The United States began to take an interest in the Danish West Indies in the late 19th century. In 1867, a treaty to sell St. Thomas and St. John to the United States was agreed upon, but the deal fell through. Second draft treaty to sell the islands to the United States was negotiated in 1902, but was defeated in the upper house of the Danish Parliament in a tie vote because the opposition carried in a 97-year-old life member into the chamber to vote, and they said he voted against it. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. American Virgin Islands. At the outset of World War I in 1914, that brought the Danish economy reforms to the island to a close, and again the islands were isolated and exposed. During the submarine warfare phases of the war, the United States, fearing that the islands might be seized by Germany as a submarine base, approached Denmark about buying them. After a few months of negotiations, a selling price of $25 million, be about $750 million today, in U.S. gold coins was agreed. The deal was finalized on January 17th when the United States and Denmark exchanged their respective treaty ratifications. The United States took possession of the islands on March 31st. It was renamed the Virgin Islands of the United States. And how many of you have vacationed in the Virgin Islands? Do you know the history? Denmark. Prohibition and Carrie Nation. In 1826, the first temperance society, the American Temperance Society was formed. While it had some success, it wasn't until the proliferation of saloons after the Civil War that the temperance movement gained more traction. These are some women, and they're demonstrating in front of a saloon because their husbands are getting good and drunk. And when they got home, some of those husbands might want to use their wives as punching bags. In 1873, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, was founded, and the temperance movement got its most forceful voice. The histories of the temperance movement and the women's movement are linked, which explains why the WCTU originally proposed the ban of alcohol as a method for preventing abuse from alcoholic husbands. The WCTU spent many years building the movement through education, local and state laws, and by 1881 had big success as Kansas enacted a ban on alcohol in their state constitution. She's got her little hatchet, doesn't she? Carrie Nation, and she's about to, and if you look at the bartender, he's scared to death because she's about ready to destroy his bar, or has destroyed the bar. It is at that time that Carrie Nation came to prominence by beating up saloons, attacking saloons with a hatchet. However, saloons still maintained their popularity, and that popularity was on the decline during what is called the Progressive Era, which started in 1890, when the hostility toward saloons became more widespread. The push for prohibition gained momentum, often with women and Protestant congregations leading the way. Close the saloons. If you believe that traffic and alcohol does more harm than good, help stop. Strengthen the American campaign, 125 East 22nd Street, New York City. During World War I, there was a temporary prohibition on alcohol production. There was also a pronounced anti-German sentiment pushed by the Anti-Saloon League, and since many brewers were German and often the loudest opponents of prohibition, the temporary situation dealt a serious blow to the anti-prohibition forces. The support for a ban on alcohol grew. And this is it. That's what goes into Congress. The 65th Congress of the United States, second session, a joint resolution. It's December 18th. Constitutional amendment to prohibit alcohol was proposed in the Senate. Well, vote dry, vote dry. There are parades, or actually demonstrations in cities saying, let's get rid of alcohol. The Prohibition movement wanted to rid American society of the tyranny of the drink, but farmers that grew fruit could retain the ability to produce hard cider, and whiskey and wine would be available for medicinal and religious purposes. Meanwhile, that's me in St. Petersburg, and that's Vladimir Lenin. And there were two revolutions in Russia that year. The Russian Revolution was one of the most explosive political events of the 20th century. The violent revolution marked the end of the Romanov dynasty and centuries of Russian imperial rule. Economic hardship, food shortages, government corruption all contributed to the disillusionment with Tsar Nicholas II. It's time for him to say goodbye. And I have relatives who were ready to push him out the door. My relatives, one of them told me, they used to pray to God that nothing bad would happen to the Tsar. And nothing good would happen to the Tsar. And they also had 6 flags, or 7 flags, in their house, depending who controlled the territory. Increasing government corruption and reactionary policies of Tsar Nicholas II and catastrophic Russian losses in World War I contributed to the widespread dissatisfaction and economic hardship. Most Russians had completely lost their faith in the Tsar. In February, riots over food scarcity broke out in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg. The army joined the rebels. And that is St. Petersburg, and that's where all the action was taking place, me and my wife in St. Petersburg. On March 11th, the troops of Petrograd Army garrison were called out to quell the uprising. In some encounters, the regiments opened fire, killing demonstrators, but the protesters kept to the streets, and the troops began to waver. The Duma formed a provisional government on March 12th. A few days later, Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne, ending centuries of the Russian Romanov rule. Between March and October, the provisional government was reorganized 4 times. Alexander Kerensky became the head in July. He survived the coup attempt by Lavrov Kamolov, but was unable to halt Russia's slide into political and military chaos. By September, the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, had achieved majorities in Petrograd and Moscow Soviets and won increasing support among the hungry urban workers and soldiers. The second Russian Revolution of the year. In early October, the Bolsheviks staged a nearly bloodless coup. Occupying government buildings and strategic points, Kerensky tried unsuccessfully to organize resistance and fled the country. The Congress of Soviets approved the formation of a new government composed mainly of Bolsheviks. That is the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. They keep it up. It's a tourist attraction, or it was before Russia invaded Ukraine and ended all kind of tourism. On October 24th and 25th, 1917, Bolshevik, the left-wing socialist forces under Lenin, seized key government buildings and stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of the new government of the Russian capital, Petrograd. The Bolshevik Revolution, also is referred to as the Great October Socialist Coup, was the first successful Marxist coup in history. The ineffectual provisional government was dislodged and was replaced with a Soviet Social Republic under Lenin's leadership on November 7th with a sickle and hammer, and that's also St. Petersburg. Civil war broke out in Russia right after the Bolshevik Revolution. The war in factions included the Red and White armies. The Red Army fought for Lenin's Bolshevik government. The White Army represented a large group of loosely affiliated forces, including monarchists, capitalists, and supporters of democratic socialism. This hasn't been solved either. The Balfour Declaration. Arthur James Balfour was a career politician in England. Started his career in 1874, became the first Lord of Admiralty in the wartime coalition, then the Foreign Secretary. On November 2nd, the Balfour Declaration was released. It was a statement of British support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for Jewish people. It was made in a letter from Arthur James Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, to Lionel Walter Rothschild, Baron II Rothschild of Tring, a leader of the Anglo-Jewish community. Chaim Weizmann. The Balfour Declaration, issued through the continued efforts of Chaim Weizmann and Nahum Sokolov, Zionist leaders in London, fell short of expectations of the Zionists who asked for the reconstruction of Palestine as the Jewish national homeland. There were Jewish settlers in Palestine, and they were outnumbered 10 to 1. 10 to 1 in Palestine. Declaration specifically stipulated that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish community in Palestine. The document, however, said nothing of the political or national rights of these communities and did not refer to them by name. Nevertheless, the declaration aroused enthusiasm, hopes among Zionists, and deemed the fulfillment of the aims of the World Zionist Organization. The British government had hoped that the declaration would rally Jewish opinion, especially in the United States, to the side of the Allied powers against the Central Powers during World War I. There were Jews who were fighting for Germany. They also helped the settlement in Palestine of a pro-British Jewish population might help to protect the approaches to the Suez Canal in neighboring Egypt and ensure vital communications route to the British colonial possession in India. Well, we're at the end here, and Seattle becomes the first city to have a hockey team in America to win the Stanley Cup. The Seattle Metropolitans won the 1917 championship by defeating the National Hockey Association's Montreal Canadiens. Seattle was the first American-based team to win the Stanley Cup. From 1893 to 1914, the Stanley Cup was a challenge trophy named after Lord Stanley of England, who never saw a hockey game, by the way. The champions held the cup until they lost their league title, or to another club or a champion from another league issued a formal challenge and subsequently defeated them in a special game or series. The National Hockey League indoors is from 1994, me there. The National Hockey League was organized on November 26th in Montreal following the suspension of operations by the National Hockey Association of Canada Limited, the Montreal Canadiens, the Montreal Wanderers, Ottawa Senators, and Quebec Bulldogs attended the founding meeting. The Toronto Arenas were later admitted as a fifth team. Quebec City decided not to operate during the first year. Its players were allocated to the remaining 4 teams. The first NHL games were played on December 19th. So, looking back at 1917 and how it impacted every one of your lives. Did it impact your lives? Sure did. Sure did. The Allies would defeat the Central Powers led by Germany November 11, 1918. The war was over, but the peace was elusive. Wilson proposed the League of Nations to settle international disputes. The body was formed by America, but America never joined the group. America did not sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 or the Treaty of Lausanne 1923, which officially ended World War I. German military leaders, led by Ludendorff, claimed that they did not lose on the battlefield, but were stabbed in the back by Jews and others. An Australian soldier who fought for the Germans bought into the myth. His name, Adolf Hitler. The United States still has the Espionage Act. It has been amended numerous times over the years. On June 8, 2023, Donald Trump was indicted on 31 counts of willful retention of national defense information and further 6 counts relating to obstruction, conspiracy, and concealing documents in a federal investigation as part of the Espionage Act. Carrie Nation, that's the bar in Boston, down a couple blocks from the State House. Prohibition of most women having the right to vote became constitutional amendments in 1920. Prohibition ended in 1933. Not all American women got the right to vote in 1920. In 1920, Native Americans were not allowed because they weren't American citizens. So the federal amendment didn't apply to them until 1924 with the passage of the Snyder Act, which allowed American-born Native women citizenship. But as late as 1962, individual states still prevented some women from voting by the use of literacy taxes, poll tax, which was taken out of circulation by a 1964 congressional amendment, and claims residents on the reservation that one wasn't a resident of the state. Native-born Americans already had U.S. citizenship in 1920, but first generation, that would be native-born Asian Americans, had U.S. citizenship in 1920, but first generation Asian Americans did not. Asian American immigrant women were therefore excluded from voting until the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1952 allowed them to gain citizenship more than 3 decades after the 19th Amendment. The shame of America. Do you know that the United States is the only land on earth where human beings are burned at the stake? 3,436 people lynched 1899 to 1922. In 2022, lynching became a federal hate crime after a century of blocked efforts. The Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act is a United States federal law which defined lynching as a federal hate crime, increasing the maximum penalty to 30 years imprisonment to several hate crime offenses. Well, America, the melting pot, comes to an end. Congress passed two anti-immigration laws, 1921, 1924, which created quotas for immigrants and kept Eastern Europeans and Asians out of America. Also created the term undocumented in 1924. Puerto Ricans are still seeking United States statehood, while the Virgin Islands the people of the Virgin Islands seem satisfied continuing to be a U.S. territory. Russia. Lenin would ultimately prevail in Russia. The Soviet Union would ally with America and Britain during World War II, defeated Nazi Germany. But United States and Soviet relations worsened following the Japanese surrender on September 2nd, 1945, which ended World War II, and the Cold War ensued. The Soviet Union collapsed on December 26th, 1991. And we leave with the Middle East. October 2023. Well, the Middle East remains a major global problem. England left the Middle East by 1948 when Israel became a nation. State of Israel seemingly has been at war with the Arab nations since its inception. The latest war was caused by Hamas terrorist attack on October 7, 2023. There have been numerous revolts and uprisings. In the Stanley Cup, National Hockey League are still around. That's my daughter when she was 4 months old, plopped into the Stanley Cup, my wife and me. The National Hockey League now has 32 teams, 25 based in America, 7 in Canada. Each franchise is now worth more than $1 billion US dollars. Any questions, any comments? Your turn. Yes, go ahead.
Does Puerto Rico really want to become a state?